Welcome everybody to the inaugural Meanjin Tournament of Books. I'm Louise Adler, a publisher with a long-held passion for writing by women, so I confess to be very keen to know the result of the tournament tonight. Now, of course, we're all here because we love a competition. Well, certainly winners love the outcome. But for those of us with absolutely nothing at stake but our favourite book winning, we hope tonight will be a night of fun, unfettered and the free flow of opinions and heated debate. And we're assuming that we'll be led in this free flow of opinions and ideas and heated discussion by a wonderful panel. We are being taped tonight, but that shouldn't inhibit you, please. We'll mention some inhibitions a bit later in the evening, but don't be inhibited right now. I'm delighted that we've been able to dragoon an illustrious panel into joining us for the tournament, so let me welcome them first to the event. First Dog on the Moon, otherwise known as Andrew Marlton, is a professional satirist who cartoons for Crikey. Of course, you'll all know him and love his work. Every day we wait for it. Scroll down to First Dog on the Moon, get that over and done with, have your giggle, and then go to the other stuff. He's also the official cartoonist to the Prime Minister, a self-appointed position. And in 2010, he wrote and illustrated a fabulous book with the best title ever, The Story of the Christmas Story, which he describes as quite good. Krien, who's over on my far left, not politically of course, just by positioning, is a writer of fiction, non-fiction, essays and poetry. Her book Into the Woods is a multi-award winning non-fiction account of the battle for Tasmania's forests. She writes regularly for The Monthly, The Big Issue, and she's had her work selected for Black Ink's Best Australian Essays, Best Australian Stories and Best Australian Poetry. And she's even more best than all of that. She's actually won the Victorian Premier's Award and the
People's Choice.
The People's Choice.
Yes,
the People's Choice,
yeah,
which is wonderful.
That, yeah.
And another award
and
for
the Queensland
Award for Public Advancement, which is fantastic. Mandy Brett is the senior editor of fiction and non-fiction with Text Publishing, where she's worked since 2002. Previously, she was with IAD Books, an Aboriginal publishing house in Alice Springs. She's also been a guest lecturer in fiction editing for the RMIT Grad Dip in Editing and Publishing. A course I can recommend to you. And Anson Cameron. Anson is an author and columnist who's written 5 novels, including Stealing Picasso, about a plot to steal Picasso's Weeping Woman from the National Gallery of Victoria. He's also been a columnist and writer for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, and his most recent collection of stories is called Pepsi Bears and Other Stories. So, why are we here tonight? Well, apparently tonight we're going to collectively decide the People's Choice of the best Australian novel by a woman. The process has been streamlined by Sally Heath, who's the editor of Meanjin, and her deputy editor Zora Sanders, and together with a number of other people, including that great Australian publisher Hilary McPhee and the Wheeler Centre's new director Michael Williams, a long short list of 15 books has been developed to help us sort the apples from the oranges, etc. So tonight we're going to announce a short list, and then you, the audience, will determine the People's Choice. So I've been instructed to tell you you're not allowed to doodle on the pieces of paper on your chairs, and there will be a point at which we stop and we pause, and you have your opportunity to nominate your favourite book by an Australian woman writer, and then we'll ask you to hand them to the end, and then as Zora is going to take away her handmaidens and handpersons, and they're going to do there's going to be a decision, and then Anna will announce the decision. So don't do any doodling, but keep your minds alert, and we have judgments to make. Now, I think that most of you are here because you feel some unease at the trend that's been developing both here and abroad. A preference, shall we say, for the male voice. So books by blokes are more likely to be nominated for literary awards, and the literary culture seems depressingly but increasingly framed and controlled and articulated by chaps. So I do want to recommend that you read Sophie Cunningham's terrific essay in Kill Your Darlings on that subject. She quotes some salient statistics from the US, and sadly our own literary culture reflects a similar inequality. In the New York Times Book Review, 40% of book reviewers were women, and 35% of the books reviewed were by women writers. In the New Yorker, 22% of book reviewers were women. In the New York Review of Books, 16% of book reviewers were women, 16% of books reviewed were by women writers. Quite extraordinary, the figures. On the other side of the Atlantic, in the London Review of Books, 22% of book reviewers were women, and only 29% of the books reviewed were by women writers. In the TLS, 27% of book reviewers were women, and 24% of books reviewed were by women writers. Here in Australia, the ABC held a quest some years ago now for the Australian book most beloved by Australian readers. The priority there wasn't necessarily our literary excellence, but nevertheless the list is very interesting. I thought I'd just read it to you. There were the top 20 in Australia were number 1, Cloud Street by Tim Winton, A Fortunate Life, A.B. Facey, Dirt Music, Tim Winton, My Brother Jack, George Johnson, The Magic
Bears,
Pudding.
Anson Cameron.
I'm sorry?
Sorry, no, keep going.
No. The Magic Pudding, Norman Lindsay, The Tree of Man, Patrick White, Seven Little Australians, Ethel Turnell, there's a lady for you, The Fortunes of Richard Marnie, Henry Handel Richardson, another of the female species, Tomorrow When the War Began, John Marsden, My Place by Sally Morgan, Power Without Glory, Frank Hardy, Power of One, Bryce Courtney, Oscar and Lucinda, Peter Carey, The Harp in the South by Ruth Park, Snugglepot and Cuddlepie by May Gibbs, Eucalyptus by Murray Bale, The Idea of Perfection from Kate Grenville, The Ancient Future by Tracy Harding, I Can Jump Puddles by Alan Marshall, and finally Voss by Patrick White. So it's quite an interesting list. They were the most loved books. So only 7 out of the top 20 novels that were culled from a national survey, in that list, there's only 7 out of the top 20 were actually by women. So tonight we're going to redress that balance. We're going to talk about literary canons, we're going to talk about what makes for a great Australian novel, and our favourite books by women writers. So what's going to happen is we are going to have a discussion among ourselves for some time, and then we're going to go through the voting process and hear about the shortlisted books that our judges here tonight, our panellists here tonight, have selected, and then open it to discussion from the floor. So let me start with a really general question to the panel. Do we have a literary canon in Australia? Mandy, maybe you could begin.
Sort of. I think sort of. I was thinking about this a bit today, and we seem to have one, but it seems to stop around about the time Patrick White got boring, as far as I can tell. Which is, that's kind of movable feast. You can put your own dollar figure on that. And actually, interestingly enough, I think if we do have a canon, there's a lot of chicks on it too, because you get your Miles Franklin and you get your Henry Handel Richardson and you get your Thea Astley. I think Thea Astley sneaks in there with her 4 Miles Franklins. But I don't think... I don't necessarily think it's a very useful way of looking at it. I think the whole canon concept is much more useful for the study of literature as an academic field, and that's really in sad decline at the moment. So I don't think it really sort of helps us with the state of things at the moment to any great extent.
But just on the question of the canon, do you think it's interesting that all the you're talking about writers up to and not really beyond, 1980? But even Thea 1980, early 80s.
Even so, a lot of these well-regarded writers are not really still viably in print.
No, that's right.
You might pick out David Malouf and Peter Carey after that time, but that's about it to mine. Just off the top of my head, more or less.
Do others on the panel want to have a comment about the literary canon or the lack thereof?
I find the idea of a literary canon a bit frightening in that it seems like it might be prescribed or prescribed by someone. A literary canon is whatever books you personally think are good, I suppose, and you want someone to... What you want is a good educator, a good teacher, widely read, who appreciates good writing, to recommend books to you. But further than that, what's in the canon and what's out, I suppose... I mean, as you say, some of the best books are out of print now, such as Life is no longer available, and, going way back to that time. I only mention that because he was a rally, but... all of us have our own individual literary canon, I think, don't we?
Anna?
I have a problem with most authors who are dead. No, not really. I find the literary canon, you're right, I think it's prescribed. And I enjoy the literary canon if it has been prescribed to me and I've read it and studied it and, pulled it to pieces and all those kind of things. But the books that I love aren't necessarily of the canon ilk. And I wouldn't... When I think of Australian fiction, and I'm desperately trying to think of women in there as well, but I think of Wake in Fright, quite cinematic novels that don't require this literary highbrow literary sort of slant to it. or even Praise by Andrew McGahn, and all those kind of books sort of really appeal to me as Australian because they feel Australian. Yeah.
Do you think we're reluctant to... we'll come to Andrew in a moment. Do you think that... It's so interesting listening to you because I was educated at a different time when canon... You absolutely had to kind of read the canon, but the canon was an English canon. It was English and, European literature. There was no discussion about, Australian literature. There was sort of ignored. But there was certainly an idea if you were a graduate from an English department that you would have read the canon. And that there was a canon. And, there was... And I think I'm
in
the
that
better
case
for
that
it.
canon had more validity because they're better books. That might be a controversial thing to say.
Yeah, that's right. That's a big... Yes.
I think that, you can't say that anyone's reached the heights of Shakespeare or Dickens or Thackeray here, perhaps.
I would say that Christina Stead is the 20th century Dickens, Charles Dickens.
Yeah, well, my take on Christina Stead was... twisted and tortured by the teacher who we did it in sixth form, and the teacher who was cramming it down her face was a turnip-faced old trout who made it into a torturous experience, and so I have trouble with the book still.
Well, I think you've touched on something here. I think there's a very strong contrarian streak. I think it's a bit of an Australian thing anyway, but I think that we are all, a lot of us are kind of set off to go, canon, am I supposed to read that? Get fucked, I'm going to read something I want to read.
I was going to mention family-friendly language later but we're there already.
It's all right, none of my family are here.
Andrew, maybe you'd like to comment.
Well, look, I thought I was mainly here for decoration.
And beautiful it is too.
Thank you. As a consumer of the occasional book, and having in fact been so delighted to discover that I have read some of the books that are on the list this evening. The idea of a literary canon, there's a joke about shooting books out of it. The sense for me is that there are a lot of books that I probably should have read, and if there is a literary canon, I'd actually like to see that list too, because I can put them with the other books on my bedside table that I do a lot of reading all day. I read the internet, and when I go on holidays, I usually read Stephen King. Sorry. But I'll get old at some point and have a lot of spare time, and that's when I'll really work through this list.
Oh, you're all breaking my heart. You're all breaking my heart. I will buy you all a copy of Henry James, The Golden Bowl, or Washington Square, or Portrait of a Lady, and we can sit and read together and pay attention to the language.
I feel like if we sit and read together, I'm all for it. Yeah. But if I'm on my own, it's not... The canon is not something I reach for, whether it's the English canon or the Soviet or Australian canon.
I certainly do, but it'd be an international canon, to be Don Quixote or perhaps War and Peace. It sounds pretentious to want to read War and Peace, but
I think they needed an editor.
For the great books.
I think those books needed an editor.
Don Quixote
That's
certainly
usually
needed about
the
8
case
editors.
in my experience.
And Leo had Mrs. Tolstoy, who rewrote War and Peace 7 times. So he did have an editor. He doesn't acknowledge her that's very interesting for our conversation today. She doesn't get acknowledged, but Mrs. Tolstoy is not there.
Right. But I mean, also, those books, weren't a lot of them written as newspaper serials. So there was definitely a sense of a television cliffhanger at the edge. And, I can imagine if I was writing a newspaper serial novel, I would try to drag my future out as far as possible as well. Hence the thickness of some of those books.
Well,
but we recently, at the Newcastle Young Writers Festival, we did Shantaram Shot Put. And... we found a use for those big novels.
So small is always good? Do you think small is better than big?
I think small is special, and I think because I like precise, clean sentences, and I feel like maybe this is why short stories perhaps hopefully are coming back, because I think there's a real craft and art form to them. And the novella is it just shows such an incredible restraint and talent to be able to tell a story and keep it small, as opposed to just sort of rolling around like in this great big sort of fat body of work. Like, I don't know. It's just sometimes. I mean, sometimes I like a big sort of jaunt, but I'm more for the clean.
And we do get stuck in prose fashions. I think one of the things that prevents people from reading old stuff is the fact that it's written in an old-fashioned way, and that we do have a fashionable taste for the clean, which I find a little bit oppressive, really. It's just it can't be good if it's not clean these days, which is complete crap, obviously.
Yeah,
it's
I love great entanglements of linguistic sort of...
People who will be opulent and elaborate and kind of wasteful in their word use. I think it's wonderful. But just partly because it's different. The clean is lovely too, but I hate to see things be decried as substandard because they're not in fashion style-wise. I think it's terribly wasteful.
Well, I didn't realise it was in fashion. It's good though. I'm glad to be in fashion.
It's always nice. Yeah. It's always nice.
So you might enjoy, there's a little collection by Patricia Highsmith called Little Tales of Misogyny. I don't even know if it's in print anymore, if anyone knows the book, but my favourite is her opening story, which is, I can't remember the name of it, but it's just, I think it's 1.5 pages, and it's all about a young man making a mistake. He asked for his fiance's hand in marriage, so she gives him her hand in marriage, and she walks around with her stump in a muff, and he doesn't understand what was wrong, and everybody tries to explain to him what was wrong with asking for a girl's hand in marriage. It ends badly, as it would, but
sounds like pornography.
But it's only I think it's 1.5 pages. It's exquisite. It's just great. It's
sounds right up my alley.
It's right up your alley. Another one we can read in our book club. Andrew, you've finished on the literary canon. You don't care. I'm devastated by this, ladies and gentlemen.
No, look, it sounds reasonably arbitrary, and I'm delighted that there are experts and people who have an idea that these are the kinds of books that say I should have been learning in school, or that my daughter should be learning in school now and probably isn't. And when I was growing up, I had such a great love of books, and when my parents took the television away for 5 years, it was terrible, but
it was good for you.
It was very good for me, and I read a great many wonderful things.
What did you read?
Let me see. The Magic Pudding.
The Magic Pudding.
Blinky Bill, Snugglepot and Cuddle Pie. And they were so formative and fantastic. Little Lobelia and the whole big bag cement thing. Hardy Boys. But it didn't take long before I figured out that they were kind of samey, and they weren't by Australian women authors either, so we probably shouldn't.
Yeah, we shouldn't be talking about that.
I think the thing about a literary canon is it is at least an attempt to say and to acknowledge that some books are fucking valuable, beautiful testaments of the human soul, and it does at least acknowledge that. And most books probably aren't, but some are, and that's what we're all reaching for.
I guess sometimes I have a problem with books that feel like they're reaching to be in the literary canon, and you're like, oh God, go in the mulch pile. So I think sometimes this idea of holding the literary canon up can actually produce, desperate, overdone work, because. So I'm wary of that whole concept, because it does seem to mean that people think they have this standard of what a book is, whereas isn't a book that's in the literary canon, isn't it just something that captured everyone, regardless of its class or its...
Captured and captures, I think. I don't think it would be
so would you call the slap, would that be something that would go in a literary canon, the slap? Because I think...
I haven't read it.
Not in the next random time scale, 20 or 30 years. To me, it's about, as you said, it's still being read later.
Yeah. So can you, in 50 years...
So is that what that was exactly where I was going to go, so is the canon created, a matter of enduring, of the kind of, that this has a life, this novel has a life beyond its moment, it's contemporary, the slap may be of this moment and resonate in a community, as it clearly did, people have engaged with it and they've discussed it and it's sold very, very well. But is canonical status dependent on your kind of, your capacity to endure the values that are in a child, the values or the quality of writing, or whatever it is that you value, that Dickens is read today you know.
I suspect we're talking about two different things, actually. I think the canon is dependent on academic analysis and respect, and on the other side, and there's a big overlap between that and books that people are still reading because they still like them. And Dickens would be solidly in the latter category. People just still like reading those terrific stories. I think he's borderline canon, really. He's not taught that much, is he?
Well, isn't it then a matter of definition and, I mean, what it says about...
Like everything.
Well, I mean, you know, Australian culture and you know, is, I don't know, Bradman's biography going to be in there? Because of what, I mean, the answer's obviously no, it's a rhetorical question there, but you know, it's like, what is an Australian literary canon something that has to talk about who we think we are, and we certainly can't agree on that anyway.
I hope they're just good books written by Australians, not about being Australian or something. When I had my first novel published, a couple of reviewers actually said it was quintessentially Australian. And I sat around thinking about that for a couple of days. I don't know what that means, but it just meant, I think, the geography was Australian. The trees were gum trees, and the patois was ochre, I suppose.
So it's Tim Winton or Peter Carey, or obviously... And you know, I have read some of those, and so when I think about, you know, Australian literature canon, I think about, I suppose, the geography and you know, the landscape, which probably isn't actually the only way to approach it.
But it is the same. When I love going to see Australian films, and it's not necessarily because I think it's going to be a good film or you know, Margaret and David have given it a tick of approval. It's just, I love hearing the Australian accent. I love seeing Australian streets. I love seeing the Australian light. I love even a scene in a backyard, and I know that that is an Australian backyard. It's not an American backyard. So there is something that and maybe it's because we don't get to see much of ourselves, bizarrely. Maybe we're not
pleased, Anna, quite frankly.
Well, I like to see us reflected, and I think especially in the cinema, you don't really see Australia reflected at all. Yeah. And I really, I guess, definitely in Australian films, I'm easily pleased because it's so nice just to hear our accent and someone not trying to speak American.
You're talking about appreciating something because actually you don't get much of it. You can't take it for granted. It's all elsewhere, isn't it? Yeah.
So we're here to talk about, you know, winners and losers, if we can use that language, about the books that we think, you know, the best Australian writers and the best Australian women writers in particular for this Tournament of the Minds. We've got a prize-winning author among us. Congratulations, Anna. Just quickly before we kind of move into, you know, talking about your shortlist, does winning a prize matter for you? What does it do for you to win a prize?
It takes my bank account from insufficient to sufficient. It's very important.
Yes.
It makes my editors and publisher like me more, which is very important. I'm not sure if it sells more books. It's not I'm not convinced. Well, I mean, only when I won this award, that when I walked into a bookshop, only then did I notice the sticker medals. So I'm not sure if that's something that I would notice before. For me, it's good. I mean, it means that I've almost sort of potentially made a wage on that book.
So it's a financial. Fundamentally, it's a financial win. And it's interesting because I think our experience is, you know, the Miles Franklin and all those awards some years have managed to give a momentum for particular books and actually driven people into bookshops to buy those books. And often those books, you know, if you look at the list of Miles Franklin winners over the last 10, 20 years, most of them have, you know, just sunk in. You know, they're not either have not been successful commercially, but lauded, you know, critically, I guess. So I think it's a kind of bizarre business. And when I think about it, I think, well, what are the Booker Prize? How come the Booker Prize is so successful? And many people in the literary community here talk about this ad nauseum. You know, what is it about the Booker that the shortlist gets supported and promoted? People go out and buy those books. They eagerly await the big event, the big announcement, and that the winner and the shortlisted writers go on to have, you know, very great lifts in their sales. And what kind of promotional activities and support go on to make that happen? It feels to me as if for all of our literary prizes, and we've got some now very generous literary prizes around the nation, that it doesn't really transform, and the sales expectations and the engagement of your audience, which I guess is not just a financial pleasure, but a cultural pleasure.
It does sometimes provide a little bit of necessary and welcome outrage that someone won the prize and so and so should have won it. It's a far better book, and so it gives literature a bit of breathing space and a bit of airtime that it doesn't normally get in that sense. And it also gives us a little thrill of outrage ourselves when we see someone's won it. But Peter Carey won it for that. What was it, Jack Maggs or something? You're kidding me. So I enjoy I'm a bit out of sympathy for women not winning literary prizes, quite frankly. I've been shortlisted for quite a number of prizes, but 4 that I can remember: the New South Wales Premier's Award, twice, the Western Australian Premier's Award for Literature, and a Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and the Age Book of the Year Award. I was shortlisted for all of them, all won by women. So you're not going to get a lot of sympathy from me on that front.
I think this goes with that, I think, the best line in the last 30 years by a poet, Clive James, who said, is it something like, the book of mine enemy has been remained, it's the opening line of his poem, the book of mine enemy has been remained and I am pleased. I think that goes with, along with, all the other schadenfreude we feel about other people's losses and our triumphs and vice versa. So let's turn to the shortlist. We need to move on, and our panel are going to announce the list and speak very briefly about each book. So, Andrew, can I come to you first?
You can, because I have a marvellous description of each book. I've got 4 of them. I've in fact brought them. If anybody wants to borrow them later, come and see me afterwards. Tiralira by the River. Born in 1916 in Queensland, Jessica Anderson was a playwright and short story writer who wrote her first novel, An Ordinary Lunacy, in 1963. Tiralira by the River, the story of a woman attempting to escape the confines of familial and marital duty. It was her 4th novel, highly praised upon its release, being described as subtle, rich and seductive. It won the Miles Franklin Award in 1978. I had a crack at it, couldn't really get into it, but that's just me.
It's a beautiful novel. Do not listen to him.
The Children's Bark. Helen Garner's second novel after Monkey Grip, The Children's Bark, was published in 1984, touching on themes of sexuality, society and morality familiar to Garner's work. Widely praised upon its release. Don Anderson wrote of it that there are 4 perfect short novels in the English language. They are in chronological order: Ford Maddox's Ford's The Good Soldier, Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, and Helen Garner's The Children's Bark. I'm sorry to say I haven't read any of them. Was going to read this one, but then the quarterly essay with Robert Mann came out, and that took over, so I will get to that. Mr. Scobie's Riddle.
Should be Mrs. Scobie's Riddle, but it's
Elizabeth Jolly. It's a 1983 novel that won the Age Book of the Year award and helped propel Jolly to long-awaited recognition in Australia and around the world. Its darkly comic tale set in St Christopher and St Jude nursing home tells of the eponymous Mr. Scobie's battles with old age, isolation, exile and ongoing struggle to maintain his dignity and spirit. Haven't even opened that one. This one, however, I got all the way through. The Harp in the South. Ruth Park was born in Auckland in 1917, moving to Sydney in her 20s to take up a position as a journalist. It was her first novel. A startling account of inner-city slum life tells the story of the Darcy family's struggle with poverty, misfortune. Her skillful and humane portrayal of the family was highly praised for its realism, warmth and intelligence, and has never been out of print since its release in 1948, and I think that's probably a good thing because I rather enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Mandy.
My turn. Okay. My first book is My Brilliant Career, published in 1901. This well-loved novel is probably best remembered for launching the career of the young Judy Davis. The book was written by Stella Maria Sarah Miles Franklin when she was still a teenager and obviously too young to bear the weight of 5 names. So, being intelligent, she ditched the female ones. The book enjoyed immediate and unexpected success. It tells the story of a headstrong girl growing up in rural New South Wales, grappling with the great life dilemma, whether to marry Sam Neill or to go and found a literary prize for men. Literary prize for men who were then, as now, apparently underrepresented. The next one is Louise's favourite, which I have to read for the first round, The Man Who Loved Children. Christina Stead's 1940 novel didn't find a wide readership until its re-release in 1965. It's been described as the greatest picture ever of the lousiest family of all time and one of the most truthful and terrifying horror stories ever written about family life. Based closely on Stead's own childhood, it's found many passionate fans, notably Jonathan Franzen, who contributed a foreword to the most recent edition, which, may I say, is a really lovely production published by Meanjin, and kudos to Louise's crew for that one, it's great. This weighs in at a solid 530 pages and thus falls into a technical category of the publishing industry known as the fat bastard. Yeah, I have to read this book, and because I'm quite lazy, I've been looking at it as a fairly short straw until I realised that somebody has to do The Fortunes of Richard Marnie.
Who is it?
I don't know. Who's got...
She's actually here tonight. She's a newborn baby.
Oh, no. Yeah, just read The Crib, I reckon, you know. Anyway, Henry Handel Richardson's magnum opus at well over 800, count them, 800 tightly set pages. It should be a lay-down misere for the fattest bastard of all. But it's actually 3 books. The first volume, The Fellowship of the... Oh, wait. No, the first volume is called Australia Felix, published in 1917, followed by The Way Home in 1925, and Ultima Thule 4 years later, and collected together under the current title in 1930. Described as an epic of huge ambition, power, pity and unflinching honesty, it tells the story of 2 young hobbits, Richard Marnie and his wife Mary, as they struggle to find peace and fulfilment against the backdrop of colonial Australia and consign the evil ring of power to oblivion in the flames of Mount Dandenong.
I have read that one, I think.
Yeah. You think? Maybe you saw the film. It was filmed.
Yeah, it sounds
yeah. Despite what the Meanjin team describes as its formidable length and sometimes dense prose, for some reason this book remains in print. And last, but by no means least, although definitely thinnest, Of a Boy by Sonia Hartnett. Known for her dark narratives and few happy endings, Sonia Hartnett wrote her first novel, Trouble All the Way, when she was 13. Of a Boy was published in 2002 and went on to win the Age Book of the Year and was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin. It's about a 9-year-old outsider called Adrian, and it's been described as beautifully melancholy and exquisitely painful novel of youth, loneliness and powerlessness. And isn't it interesting how so often when people want to praise a book, they end up making it sound deeply uninteresting? I'm actually reading this book at the moment, and I would just like to add that while all of the above is true, and while this is not in any way a book filled with, you know, dramatic action scenes and sex and explosions, it's absolutely and completely gripping. I'm really loving it. I haven't got to the bit where the Southron forces storm the ramparts of Gondor, but I'm sure Sonia Hartnett is going to do it justice when she gets there.
Thank you very much, Mandy. Anson.
I'm the guy in the black hat here. I agreed to do this before realising that I knew absolutely nothing about Australian women's literature. And I racked my brain and thought, what was the last book I'd read written by an Australian woman? And it turned out to be The First Stone by Helen Garner. In my defence, I read it this year.
Did you read the books that beat you in the competition?
Certainly not. I burnt them. You can't read all the books that beat you in the competition, so there's too many. So the first of the 4 novels that I'm introducing is called Carpinteria. Alexis Wright's 2006 Miles Franklin winning novel is a sprawling, ambitious epic. I bought these boots tonight across the road for $100, second-hand boots. They were shining in my eye. Carpenter is the second novel by Alexis Wright. It's the story of the Phantom family living in the precarious coastal settlement of Desperance. Isn't that lovely? Where magic and superstition blend with the realities of everyday life and everyday pain in a complex, vibrant narrative unique to Wright's storytelling style. I don't know who wrote these blurbs, but I can tell you writing blurbs is one of the hardest pieces of writing you'll have to do. I've written some for my own books. You know, publishers say to you, oh, please, you're so good at those short, punchy, catchy things. Why don't you... So you go to write... It's like writing a bloody eulogy for one of your own children. I've just spent 2 years bringing this thing up, and now I've got to tell everyone how good it is in 50 words. So, congratulations to whoever's out there who wrote these blurbs. The second book is The Lost Dog, published in 2007 by Michelle de Kretzer. It's her third novel of displaced and subtle characters in contemporary Melbourne. It was longlisted for the Booker and won the Commonwealth Literary Prize and the New South Wales Premier's Book of the Year. Lost Dog was praised upon its release as a wonderfully written novel that is often funny, but despite its sharp critical intelligence, it is not at all cynical. I enjoy the cynical, so that's probably not one for me. The World Beneath. This was Kate Kennedy's first novel, after much success as a short story writer. Published in 2009, The World Beneath is the story of Sandy Rich. I don't think we needed that apostrophe. Sandy Rich and their 15-year-old daughter Sophie. In an attempt to reconnect with his largely estranged daughter, Rich takes Sophie on a hiking trip to Tasmania, site of past victories on the Franklin blockade. The novel of family dynamics and generational conflict has been highly praised as bracing, unsentimental and often very funny. Which leaves only The Secret River by Kate Grenville. Kate Grenville's 2005 novel, The Secret River, is a detailed, vivid account of the brutality and tragedy of early encounters between Indigenous Australians and white settlers. I thought it was a true history. Based on her own family history, this highly regarded novel was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin and the Man Booker in 2006 and is now a fixture as a school and university text. That's what we're all hoping for. That's the four that I'm introducing.
Thank you. Anna?
The first one's got a bit of a soft spot in my heart because it was a school text, Looking for Alibrandi, published in 1990 by Melina Marchetta. It's YA, and I'm glad to see some young adult in the list because I think a lot of really good books get lost in young adult, and maybe there's some lost females there. So I think that's something to think about. Told in first person, it's a coming-of-age story of Josie Alibrandi as she goes through her final year of high school. It won the Children's Book Council of the Year award in 1993 and was made into a film in 2000. And I don't know anyone who's seen the film, but there's that great scene of making the tomato sauce in the garage and the cement lawn. It's quintessential Australia.
Here you are, with a cement lawn.
We've got The Kindness Cup by Fia Astley. Fia Astley, who I actually haven't read any of. Is she in our reading group? Okay.
Yes. Definitely.
Prolific writer. Her career lasted for over 40 years with 15 novels. She's won more Franklin Awards than any other writer in Australia. In 1994, she wrote A Kindness Cup, a story of guilt, justice and revenge in Queensland, when Tom Doherty returns to the township where a young woman leapt to her death 20 years earlier. His attempts to find justice for her are unwelcomed by all. Which actually sounds really good.
Yeah. Good.
Well, I like a story, and I feel like maybe that's where sometimes I feel like, not just Australian female writers, but potentially Australian male writers. It's always a sort of wafty kind of ethereal, who am I? But sometimes I really like a story.
Well, we've only been here 2 minutes. You've got to stop and look around for a while first.
Okay, cool. Gilgamesh by Joan London, which I have read. Inspired by the epic of Gilgamesh, the world's oldest known poem. Joan London's 2001 novel was set between wars and across continents. This blurb is kind of interesting. The first dull length. What's dull length mean?
Dull length? I think it's a typo.
Dull length.
Full. It wasn't a Freudian slip. I had nothing to do with it.
It is interesting, though.
It is interesting.
Yeah.
How'd you like that on the back of your book, on the blurb? First dull length.
Gilgamesh went on to be shortlisted for the Miles Franklin, and it also won the Age Book of the Year. Was that a problematic moment for you?
No, it was some old bird, I can't remember her name. She subsequently died.
Oh, well.
It was a good
Swings
day.
and roundabouts.
She hadn't done it a couple of years earlier, and I might have got the prize.
Oh.
I'm not bitter.
You're not bitter.
So that's Joan London. It's an interesting novel. It's readable. I think I describe it as it reads a little bit like raw rations in a war. It's you treasure the rations, but at the same time, it's a little bit dull sometimes. So Yeah.
You ought to be affecting the people's voting.
Oh.
No,
they
because
can't vote for something
they're
they
not
haven't
voting.
read.
This is our nomination.
Yeah,
This is
yeah.
our selection.
I don't think I have that much influence.
And Anna is only talking about 3 novels here because she will announce the people's choice when you have voted. So I think we'll now pause for a moment. We'll let our audience do their voting. And just to remind you of the rules again, I'm supposed to remind you of the rules. You can't vote for another book by an author that's already on the list, which I know, I feel deeply aggrieved myself, but that's the rules set by Zora, and she's in charge tonight. And so no books, alternative books by other, they're already engaged, they're not listening, they're just off and running. And you have to vote for a book by an Australian woman writer, not an Australian male writer, and your book can be from any period in history. So there are pens coming up and down the aisles, and when you've finished voting, we'll give you 5 minutes. Just send them to the end of the row.
Does it have to be fiction?
Has to be fiction. Fiction. Has to be fiction. Okay, the voting is now going to begin. The handmaidens, there's more papers coming up this end. So there's voting, furious vote counting. I think we have, what do they call them, invigilators. We have Graham Richardson doing the counting for those of us who are determined that our author should win. They're all off, they're going. The counting begins. And we're now going to, yes, give them a clap. Thank you. And so now we go to the audience when we ask you what your views are while we're waiting of this list, and not what you put on your voting paper, but what you think of the status of Australian women writers in Australia, and the list that we've got up here, and which would get your votes, or why, and what your view is of the conversation we've had to date. So, questions from the audience, and there are microphones here. There's a question there, straight away.
Mine is not really a question but a comment, and I find it quite extraordinary that the panel has read so little of the fabulous writing by Australian women.
You're no more disgusted than I am.
And also that for those who have not read The Fortunes of Richard Marnie, you are really doing yourselves a great disservice by not reading it. It is a brilliant, wonderful novel about Australia, and I would encourage you all to read it. But as I said, I'm very disappointed at how little you've all read.
Clap that.
And there's another comment up the back, or question up the back, yes, right at the end.
Can I just, in our defence, I think it's mainly me and Anson who haven't read any of these books. I think the rest of the panel have really done quite well, so
But chivalry. And further in my defence, I find I don't read a lot of Australian literature at all.
He only reads what he writes himself.
No, I have read a few other authors, but I find it a little disquieting to read other Australian authors because, well, if they're not very good, it's no fun to read a book that's not very good, and a fair bit of stuff that's published in the country isn't. But if they are good, it's disquieting from a competitive point of view, and it's a little intimidating. So, I haven't read Peter Carey's last novels or Tim Winton's, or it's not just Australian women I'm neglecting Australians in general. Hope that makes you feel better about yourself.
There's another question.
With this list, and with a lot of the fiction that we're calling quintessential Australian, when you're talking about how a lot of what makes quintessential Australian literature quintessential is in the setting and lies in that sort of typically Australian setting, do you think that's necessary only to Australian books? I mean, do other countries have that need to really lay on the backdrop and the setting of the country so thickly to be called Australian? Can an author have a successful Australian novel without setting it in Australia at all, even?
I think it's a terrific question, because that question of Australian identity. And I always remember that Frank Morehouse, who I thought that, I think it's Grand Days, and he's written 2 novels so far in that trilogy about the Australian woman who goes to the League of Nations, the sort of the predecessor to the UN, and they're fabulous novels. I think they're quintessential Australian novels. He's not allowed, he's not considered, what do you call it? Eligible for the Miles Franklin Award because the novel is set outside Australia. I mean, what a parochial idea, but
and that's the same with M.J. Hyland's books as well. Yeah, what wasn't. I mean, that was that's Miles Franklin winner, but because it wasn't set in Australia.
But so then is it
Good
about
books are steeped in their geography and in the architecture and the culture that surrounds them, but the really good books transcend that, don't they? I mean, I know Huck Finn couldn't have been anywhere than where it was set, but the story Huck Finn, the story arc and the whole story just transcends Mississippi. Dickens couldn't have been anywhere else but London, except at brief moments he's in Paris or somewhere, but it all transcends Dickensian London, the stories and the,
But you can have an Australian writer who can do all that, but they just haven't chosen Australia as that landscape.
Absolutely.
So they can do a great book, but because it's not in Australia, for some reason it doesn't become...
that's my
well, we are
point
kind of
I
tense
hope
about it, aren't we? We're kind of tense about landscape. It's kind of all we've got. I mean, you had an extended riff about it before. You love to see it.
I do like to see it. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, it's true. It's so important to you to know where you are in those, to see it reflected back.
Yeah.
Well, I reckon Annie Proulx writes great Australian novels in that they feel like they're so geographical and they're so built into the landscape and they're so about the people who live there that we're not having an Australian literary canon, we're having a geographical canon of some sort. So I would name her in even though she obviously isn't.
Post-industrial Western cities are all much of a muchness, so if you want to get idiosyncratically Australian, it sort of helps to move out into the country because it is different to the rest of the world. Whereas St Kilda and South Yarra is not so different to Greenwich Village or any amount of other places you can name.
But Anna said before what she responds to is the Hills Hoist or the concrete lawn or the light or there is something that she identifies with that is particularly Australian.
But it won't survive, like it won't sustain me if it's just relying on those hooks. It's like, look, if I draw an Aussie picture and I don't worry about the plot or the story or the pace, which does seem to happen. People do seem to give a lot of kudos to books that are just sort of draped over the Australian landscape, but they don't actually really have a story to carry it along. So, yeah, but I mean, it has to have two things. And an Australian landscape is a plus for me, but if it hasn't got a story to take me with it, then so be it.
But do you think this preoccupation of I think it's a really interesting question, that the preoccupation is a kind of about our history, that we are, 200 years, how old we are. It's a relatively young country. The literary kind of oeuvre is a young oeuvre. The body of work we've been able to produce, it's limited by, population, by history, by the, white settlement, occupation, whatever you want to describe, however one wants to describe it. And it's our identity is a preoccupation. So our preoccupation with the landscape, with the vernacular, with the images, with the, idiom, with the sort of topography of this place is the preoccupation at this point, and that might change. I don't know whether that's the case, whether we evolve. Are the French as preoccupied by their kind of sense of identity as we are, or do they escape it, or the British, or are they just as preoccupied as the question of and how old we are? I don't know the answer.
I definitely think it's a sign of insecurity. I mean,
I think Australian literature, I don't know why I'm commenting, I've just admitted I don't read any of it, but if it has a failing, it's an attempt to be a little too sincere and a little too serious about itself, I find. But as I say, I'm no expert on it.
Let's have more questions from the audience.
Yeah, I'm just following on from that question before about how little some of you have read. I'd like a show of hands from the audience about how many the people here have read. I mean, how many of us have read 5 out of them or 10 out of the 15?
So do we want to take a sort of view of the audience? How many of you would have read 5 of the novels on that list up there? 1, 2, 3, 4.
That's
1, 2, 3,
disgraceful.
4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. About 12 out of 150 would have read 4 or 5 or more.
And you call yourself a literary audience.
I don't even know why I was asked to be here, but you people, you know why you're here, and that's just not good enough. And I think that's indicative of probably what's the problem with literary culture in this country.
We choose a book, so I particularly choose a book on whether it's a woman writer or a male writer. I read it for the story.
Yeah.
But do you follow? I'm sorry, go on, Anna.
No, but I think that's part of the debate surrounding whether there needs to be an award solely for female writers, which it's something that's been coming up a lot. And I think there is going to be a female prize, a female Australian writer prize. And there has been a lot of debate about that. Like, the book should win on its own merits. But when you do read Sophie Cunningham's statistics, they don't necessarily align with merits. There does seem to be a lopsidedness when books actually get promoted, and you might not necessarily hear of a really good book by a female writer because it hasn't been promoted properly. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, but the stats you were giving us, Louise, to begin with, didn't tell us how many books had been written by men as compared to women. Maybe guys are writing a lot more books.
No, that's also something that sort of needs to be highlighted and examined and looked at.
And so then the awards, the Stellar Award here that's, we're hoping to establish, or the Orange Prize in Britain, which has been going for a long time, which every year engenders the same old argument from blokes, if you'll forgive me, Anson, and, about why do we need a special prize, actually meant that they've supported and encouraged women writers, and they've paid particular attention to those writers, and they've needed that attention and focus in order to get promoted, in order to get debate going, Are there differences?
Do you think that might make it harder for a woman to win the Miles Franklin because the judges might say, look, this one's good and this one's good, but she might win the...
No.
Judges don't.
Million trillion years. No,
they don't. In my experience of judging, I've never had someone say, let's not give it to her or him because he's going to win the other one. Or he's going to clean up.
What you're saying is there's no bias in the judging?
I don't think there's conscious bias in very many of these aspects of things. I think we're all imbued with the disadvantages of living in a very deeply gendered and deeply historically gendered environment. We don't know what we're doing half the time.
But when the judges...
that's what it is. It's 15 and 20 and 30%. That's what we're doing. What it is. We don't even know we're doing it. I don't know I'm doing it, and I am,
But when the judges come out and repeatedly say, yes, well, it did strike us at the end of the process that we had no women on the shortlist, it doesn't mean that you should put a woman on a shortlist just because she's a woman, but actually, really, there were no substantial women writers in the last year's Miles Franklin. There were no significant women writers who should have been included. Seems a little odd. I mean, I can't, summon up what was published.
I mean, I don't know much about this, but I imagine the judges is just as many women judges as men.
Haven't done a study of that, but if it'd be easy to do a survey of how many of the judges are actually women, how many are men. But a whole lot of preconditions.
But the opposite side of it, obviously, is you have to say, well, then what it says, if women aren't being nominated and women aren't winning these prizes, well, the obvious conclusion is they're not as good. And we simply know that that's not the case, so it's something else. It's capitalism and patriarchy, and we don't have to go into it, but that's kind of what it is.
Well, yes, we do. We do. Painful as it might be, we do.
So prizes like this, do they redress the balance? I don't know. Do we get to talk a lot about it and have a complain? Yes, and isn't that
consciousness raising? It was there in the 70s, and it was good for people. And this is what this is about.
I was reading, in order to catch up, one of Sophie Cunningham's articles in Crikey today, which is, you should check it out if you haven't. And the comments were very much of the, well, of course we should do this. And then the responses were, well, no, I mean, these things should be on their merit. And it should, if they're not getting nominated, then perhaps women aren't, or there's not as many, perhaps women write slower or something. I mean, it wasn't like that. But it's those kind of things. And I did most of my political understanding to start with in the 80s, when you could never say things like that. You could never... People didn't even ask those questions, whereas people aren't asking questions anymore at the same time. They're just making blanket statements, which is, well, this reverse discrimination is exactly that, and it doesn't work. And I find that so frustrating because the numbers clearly indicate that women writers are not as well represented even if they are beating Anson. That's an outlier. And other than that, somebody needs to do something
about them beating Anson.
Yeah, well, that too. No, clearly that was a disgrace. But other than that.
I think there's one more question. Zora is very keen that we should finish, but the new baby, wants to ask a question, and her mother is going to channel the question.
Okay, this is what my 7-week-old would say. Our ideas about what makes a good book are clearly something that people disagree about. They're contested. And I think part of the issue, of course, is that our ideas about what makes a good book are gendered. So our ideas about what is a serious novel, what is a big enough novel, what are the kinds of subjects that we should write about that make an award-winning novel are gendered in ways that we're not really aware of, as you said. So I think these are unconscious biases, as a lot of people in these debates have been talking about. So,
thank you. Maybe that's true, but if it is true and there are an equal number of men and women on the judging panels, then why aren't we coming up with equal number of winners of the prizes?
Yeah,
but that lady was saying that these ideas are gendered and so women will go for one novel.
No.
Oh, wasn't she?
No.
What was she saying?
She's saying that our bias is internalised and completely unconscious but really quite
we all
strong.
have the
Am I
same.
right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I also say there was a lot of talk about Jonathan Franzen's freedom, that if a woman had written it, would it have would it have been as successful as if he had written it? And that's the fine line between saying, oh, I could have done that painting, but you didn't do that painting. But there is something to be said for it's a very domestic, suburban, look at the nightmarish drollness of our lives kind of book, which you can see, you could imagine the response. If a female had written it, you could have said, oh, it's a domestic, Jane
Austen for the 21st century.
Yeah, and I mean, he would never do it, but wouldn't it have been amazing if he put it out under a female pseudonym and just seen what would have happened? Would it have sunk?
You'd have nothing to compare it against.
Well, no, but it still
he wouldn't have put it out then under his own name.
No, it's a totally illogical hypothesis, but
we like
interesting thought experiment.
It would have been interesting.
Very interesting, but he wouldn't have had the courage. Now we come to the highlight of the evening, which is the People's Award, and we need a drum roll. Someone needs to do a drum roll into the microphone, and Anna is going to read out of a gold envelope. And the winner of the People's Choice Award for the inaugural Meanjin Tournament of Books is?
Well, it got more than double the votes of any other book. Over Newton by Isabel Carmody.
Oh, very interesting. Thank you. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
And I love Isabel Carmody. So,
Has she finished the series yet?
Yeah, it kind of meandered to a close, I think.
Well, that's going to bring to a close this event. This is the first part of the process, of course. This is just the People's Choice Award, but the competition goes on. Zora has explained it to me repeatedly. It's like a tennis match, she says to me. Louise, think of Rafa and Federer and working it out. There's competition, there's debate.
Serena and Sam.
Serena and Sam. I'm absolutely 100% correct. Serena and Sam. And there are successive rounds. So the next round will be on the meanjin.com.au website, and it'll be Anna Krien taking on 2 books. Do you want to reveal what the 2 books are? Anna, would you like to reveal what the 2 books are on Monday?
The Lost Dog by Michelle de Kretzer and Gilgamesh by Joan London.
Fantastic. So that's round 1 of the Tournament of Books. And there is, I think, very excitingly, and only Zora could have thought of this, there is a semi-final entitled, what's it called? The zombie semi-final, which is the return of all those books that have been ditched. So you can then renominate and resubmit the books that you think should not have fallen out of the match and can be reinserted. So it's the return of the zombie.
I have to read those ones.
And Andrew is going to read those books. There are a number of thank yous I have to do before we close the event. First of all, to our panel, can you please join me in thanking them? To Michael Williams and the Wheeler Centre for their support in putting this event on, but most particularly to Zora Sanders, whose idea this was. Indeed. Copies of Meanjin are on sale at the back. I hope you will support Zora and Sally Heath in their endeavours. It's a fabulous magazine. It's got a fantastic history and pedigree to it, and this next stage in its life is equally exciting. So Meanjin in print and meanjin.com.au. Thank you very much for joining us.